On a calm evening in 1969, two men in a small boat on a Scottish loch did something that sounds insane until you understand what they were looking at. One of them picked up an oar and began swinging it at the water. The other loaded a rifle and fired into the loch. They were not drunk. They were not panicking over nothing. They were experienced local men, and they had just been struck, twice, by something in the water that was larger than their boat. Almost no one outside the Highlands knows it, but Scotland has a second lake monster. It lives a few miles from the world-famous loch that made an entire country synonymous with monsters, in water that is deeper than Loch Ness, wilder than Loch Ness, and far less watched. And unlike its celebrated neighbor, this one has a night that ended with two men firing a rifle into the dark. This is Loch Morar, the deepest body of fresh water in all of Britain, and the people who live along its shore have a name for the thing those men fired at. They call it Morag. Hold on to that 1969 encounter, because everything in this story builds back toward it, and toward the single question it leaves behind. What do you shoot at in 1,000 feet of water that comes back for a second piss? For generations, outsiders dismiss the Morag stories as folklore, the kind of legend any isolated community develops to explain drownings in dangerous water. But the people of Morar never treated their monster as a charming tale for tourists. In the old Highland tradition, a sighting of Morag was an omen, a warning of death. Families along the loch taught their children to read the water and to leave it the moment it turned wrong. These were not vague monster myths. They were specific instructions, passed down as survival knowledge, taught to children who would spend their lives on a loch their elders genuinely believed could kill them. And that raises the first question worth sitting with. Why would a community invent not a story, but a set of rules? The answer starts with the loch itself, because Loch Morar is not an ordinary lake. It is the deepest freshwater lake in the British Isles, plunging to over 1,000 feet, deep enough to swallow most of the world's tallest buildings beneath its black surface. And it was carved by glaciers. At the end of the last ice age, as the ice retreated and the land rose, lochs like Morar were sealed off from the sea. Remember that, because it is the most important fact in this entire story, and it answers the objection every skeptic raises first. How could a creature get into a landlocked lake, and how could a population survive there? The answer is that nothing had to get in. Whatever was swimming in that water when the ice closed, the door was trapped inside it, and it never left. The loch is far deeper than it is wide, and below a certain depth, the water turns to a cold black layer where almost no light reaches, and the temperature stays near freezing all year. This does something crucial. Sound bends and scatters where the warm surface water meets the cold deep, which means sonar becomes unreliable across that boundary. An animal sitting just below that line can be effectively invisible to a boat passing directly overhead. One researcher described it as a cloak. You could be on the surface, staring down into water that looks completely empty, while something massive sits in the dark just beneath you. Keep that idea in mind too, the cloak, because it explains why an animal could be both real and almost impossible to film. So we have a community that built survival rules around the water, and a loch uniquely capable of hiding something in it. For most of recorded history, the sightings were easy to wave away. A shape, a wake with no boat behind it, a dark back breaking the surface at dusk, and gone before anyone could be sure. And then came 1969, and the encounter that could not be filed under folklore because it left two witnesses, a damaged boat, and an account too specific to dismiss. The two men were crossing the loch that evening when something struck the hull. Their first thought was a floating log, but the water there was hundreds of feet deep, with nothing to hit. Then the thing surfaced alongside them, and it was no log. It was a long, dark, living animal, by their account larger than the boat itself, with rough, dark skin and a series of low humps along its back. It struck the boat again, hard enough to rock it violently. That is when one man swung the oar and the other reached for the rifle and fired. The animal submerged and was gone. Questioned separately, both men gave the same description, and neither ever took it back. They were not sensation seekers. They were locals who had every reason, living where they lived, to wish they had never spoken of it. That night opened the floodgates, the way one credible sighting always does. People who had stayed quiet began to talk, and over the following decades the reports built into a pattern too consistent to ignore. A schoolteacher and a group of children watching a large humped animal cross the surface. Fishermen whose heavy gear was sheared or dragged by something far stronger than any fish the loch was supposed to hold. Boats bumped from below in deep water, far from any rock. Different witnesses, different decades, no contact between them, all describing the same animal. Long body, rough dark hide, low humps, a way of moving that was wrong for anything they could name. When researchers finally turned modern technology on the loch, the results were not proof, but they were not nothing either. Sonar surveys returned large contacts at depth, objects too big and too deliberate to match the known fish of the loch, vanishing into that cold cloaking layer before they could be resolved. And then, more recently, environmental DNA sampling, in which water is analyzed for the genetic traces animals leave behind, found something nobody expected. Alongside the salmon and trout, the surveys revealed an unusual abundance of eLDNA in the deep water, and traces that did not cleanly match the reference databases at all. Hold that detail, the eLDNA, because it is about to matter. Now we can do the thing both the believers and the skeptics tend to skip, which is ask seriously what it could actually be. The giant eel is the most grounded explanation, and that unexpected eel DNA gives it real weight. But here's the problem. The size the witnesses describe goes far beyond any eel on record, and an eel does not rock a boat or break the surface in humps. A sturgeon, a huge armored prehistoric-looking fish, fits the dark ridged back, but sturgeon are bottom feeders that do not behave the way the Morar animal behaves. Every ordinary candidate explains part of the description and fails on the rest. And that failure points straight back to the glacial history. A population of large animals, sealed into this loch when the ice retreated, adapted over thousands of years to its cold, deep, isolated water, surviving in numbers low enough that they have never given science a body. Which brings the hardest objection, the one skeptics are right to raise. If these animals are real, where are the carcasses, and how are there enough of them to breed? The answer is in the shape of the loch. It is over 1,000 feet deep. An animal that dies in that cold black water does not wash ashore. It sinks into a depth no one searches and stays there. As for numbers, a deep, cold, productive lake can sustain a small population of large, slow-growing, long-lived predators for an immense span of time, hidden below a layer of water that defeats our instruments. We do not find the evidence, because the one place it would be is the one place we never look, the bottom. And if that sounds impossible, there is a precedent that is not a matter of belief. In 1938, fishermen off South Africa hauled up a coelacanth, a large, heavy, ancient fish that science had declared extinct for over 60 million years. It had not been hiding on purpose. It had simply been living in deep water nobody had any reason to search, and an entire confident consensus collapsed in a single afternoon. The lesson is not that every legend is true. It is that the absence of a specimen in water we have barely explored is not proof that nothing is there. Loch Morar is not even alone in this. The same glacial history shaped a chain of deep lakes that all carry the same persistent reports. Loch Ness, a few miles away, with its centuries of sightings. Lake Champlain on the United States and Canada border with its champ. Okanagan in Canada, with a creature its indigenous people described long before Europeans arrived. Lakes once joined to the sea, sealed off as the ice melted, each potentially trapping a population that then adapted in isolation into something unknown. If that happened anywhere, the deepest and most remote of them all is exactly where you would expect it. So return, finally, to that boat in 1969, because now the question it left behind has an answer, even if it is not the one anyone wanted. Two experienced men, on water hundreds of feet deep, were struck twice by something larger than their boat, watched it surface with a humped dark back, and fired a rifle at it. The official record offers nothing to explain it. The folklore that warned their grandparents to leave the water describes it exactly. The sonar finds it and loses it in the cold. The DNA hints at it without naming it. The glacial history makes it possible. And the depth of the loch guarantees that the one thing that would settle the argument, a body, lies where no one will ever retrieve it. Loch Morar is still there, still the deepest water in the British Isles, still cold, still black below the thermocline, still holding whatever it has held since the ice sealed it off from the sea. The crowds go to the famous loch with their cameras. Morar stays quiet, and deep, and patient, and whatever those two men fired at on a calm evening more than 50 years ago is, by every indication, still down there, in the dark, below the reach of our sonar and our cameras, in the one part of Scotland the people who know it best have always insisted is anything but empty. If you have seen something in the water that you could not explain, something too large, too deep, too old for the world you thought you knew, we want to hear about it. Leave it in the comments. Subscribe to my channel for more accounts from the deep.